Alrighty, Benjamin says, I'm a longtime listener. I have a question regarding the Old Testament. I'm currently going through a Bible study of the Old Testament, was wondering what is the Jewish religious perspective on the book of Joshua. It seems to be a very harsh book that doesn't align with a lot of my values, especially when it comes to wiping out entire populations of people. It doesn't seem like God would command his covenant people to do such a thing. Thanks so much for your time. So the thing to understand about the book of Joshua or elements of the Old Testament, the position against Amalek, for example, or Midian, is that when it comes to ancient peoples, and by the way, most semi-modern peoples, the idea of full-on wiping out your enemies was a common practice of the time. And so the real shocker in the book of Joshua is that it's restricted to certain circumstances, meaning that if you go back to even the history of Native Americans, and you see how tribes wiped each other literally off the planet, it is a common feature of human history that tribal warfare results in mass murder. The key to the Old Testament is to understand that that is sort of the way of the world. And so what you're actually looking at is moderation of that, because God is only giving specific commands to do this with specific people, as opposed to the broader command that is generalized throughout human history to do it to pretty much everybody else. Rachel says, there's so many things about Judaism I treasure as part of my heritage. Many of the laws, like family purity laws, I think are very useful. The issue I struggle with is to believe the laws of the Torah and rabbinic law are actually from God. That makes it much harder to follow them in a disciplined manner. The Reform and conservative congregations are too lefty for me to feel comfortable, and Orthodox settings don't feel right either, since our beliefs just aren't in line with the Orthodox worldview. My husband and I feel spiritually homeless. We're not sure what to do. We're expecting our child in late September. We want to avoid passing on this spiritual crisis to her. What are your suggestions? Well, my view is Aristotelian and Maimonidean, and that is you practice, and then the belief comes later. What I mean by that is that if you believe in a sort of natural law perspective, right, you believe that family purity laws are good because they actually foster family well-being, and you believe that the family structures that are posited by Orthodox Judaism, if that's the right structure, and it's the right structure because it follows in line with evolutionary biology and human reason, and that traditional wisdom passed on over the course of thousands of years is very productive, you do have to start asking questions like, why is that traditional wisdom so good? What about it makes it so good? And if you believe that there is a creator to the universe who made us capable of understanding the universe such that we could actually establish cultures in line with the necessities of natural law, there's a godly element to that. So I'd start from that grain, right? When it comes to whether you're Christian or whether you're Jewish or whether you're Muslim, when it comes to the question of revelation, what that really means to me is that at a certain point you will have to take a leap of faith. And revelation is by necessity a faith-based proposition. If it were not, then you wouldn't have to have it. Revelation is the idea that God speaks to humanity in certain miraculous ways, whether it is God on Sinai if you're Jewish, or whether it is Jesus walking amongst us if you're a Christian, or whether it is Muhammad giving prophecy if you're a Muslim. Whatever your system of revelation, that inherently acknowledges that there is a gap between humanity and understanding of the universe that cannot be bridged without God reaching down to us. So the real question that you should ask yourself is not sort of the doctrinal question of how do I believe something that requires a faith-based leap. It's an informed leap of faith. Right? That's what I would say, is that there's no way to escape the leap of faith. There's no way to escape the question of this seems counterintuitive, this seems not linked with reason, the idea that God breaks the natural system and speaks directly to human beings, right? That because you haven't seen it happen to you, for example. But the other reality is that you cannot live a life rooted in any sort of principle unless you also take that leap of faith. Right? There are people I'm friends with, people like Sam Harris, who believe that you can create an entire moral construction without that leap of faith. I don't believe that's true. I think you're going to have to make certain assumptions about the universe that are faith-based leaps. And so it doesn't seem to me like revelation is the dumbest leap of faith. It seems like the dumbest leap of faith to me is to suggest that human beings are capable of understanding aught about the universe, that what you ought to do, a moral law in the universe from just evolutionary biology, which doesn't even suggest inherent human worth. That's a bigger leap of faith to me. And given human history's ability by human beings to rationalize the worst sort of predations against one another, it seems to me a lot more unrealistic to hope that human beings are going to be able to use, quote unquote, their natural reason to divine purposes in the universe without some sort of leap of faith suggesting that there's a linkage between the universe and how your mind works, and that linkage is made by God himself. Long answer to a short question, but I think that it's worthwhile. Avery says, I just got into an argument with someone in a bar about Judaism. That sounds like a fun bar fight right there. Have you ever read Zechariah? Okay, anyway, is it being Jewish or Judaism a race, or is it an ethnic religious group? I know it seems redundant. I need to settle an argument. Thanks. The answer is it's both. So in Judaism, under the religion of Judaism, people who have a mother who is Jewish are born Jewish. And they can't change that. You can't change your Jewish status. You are subject to Jewish law. Now, as far as whether this makes you particularly Jewish in practice, that's a different question. So there are a lot of Jews who don't practice Judaism. They're ethnically Jewish, but they have no relationship with Judaism. It's not really part of their identity. And so I have very little concern about their thoughts about Judaism. Usually the, well, I'm Jewish argument gets brought up in two contexts. One is where people actually practice some form of Judaism or hold it as a deep part of their identity, and so they have some credibility to speak on it. And one is when people use it in the United States, use it as an excuse to not be labeled part of the white majority. You see this with the left a lot. You'll see a lot of Jewish leftists who will be like, well, as a Jew, I say X, Y, and it's like, no, I'm sorry. You don't get to claim your ethnic Judaism as some form of minority status, given the fact that you have no association with Jewish practice or Jewish ideas. So Judaism is both, and that makes for a confusing conversation. But the truth is, it's only both because of religion. Because in the end, the sort of ethnic status, it's not like, I mean, Jews come in all shapes and sizes, right? My wife's a Moroccan Jew. She looks very different than Ashkenazi Jews. And there are black Jews from Ethiopia, right? Like, there are lots of different types of Jews. The common thing they have is a history with Judaism. The sort of ethnic composition of the Jewish people is pretty diverse, in the same way that Christianity is pretty diverse. There are a lot of Christians of various different races. Jonathan says, I'm a Christian guy in my 20s. I recently started a Bible reading plan that covers the whole Bible in a year. I've not read that much of the Old Testament before. Some of the stories are interesting to me. Can you explain the difference between the Old Testament, the Torah, and the Talmud? Sure. So the Old Testament is the Torah. It depends on, the Torah is the 5 books of Moses. Typically, when people say the Old Testament, they mean Tanakh, meaning the Torah, the Nevi'im, meaning the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. Okay, so more than the 5 books of Moses. So the Torah is the 5 books of Moses. The Old Testament, I've heard it variously referred to as the Pentateuch, which would be the Torah, or as kind of the broader corpus, which would involve the books of Samuel and the books of Kings and Judges and all the rest of that. That'd be the Old Testament. And then the Talmud is actually a long, like 73-volume disquisition on the law. So you have to understand that in Jewish philosophy, there is the written Torah, and then there's what's called the oral Torah, which is sort of the common law tradition that was passed down by Moses, the understanding of the Torah given to Moses on Sinai at the time, according to traditional Jewish theology. And that was eventually written down in about 2nd century CE by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. And then there was wide discussion of what that oral law meant, and that got encoded in the Talmud, which is those 73 volumes. So those are all of the differences. So the Talmud is basically a legal code that looks back to the Old Testament for sources. The Old Testament is broader than the Torah. The Torah is the 5 books of Moses. Thomas says, hey, Ben, I disagree with you strongly on the topic of racism in America. I'm a white guy. I know for a fact through personal conversation, young black men are continuing to feel as though they are a perceived threat. I've never argued that young black men aren't feeling like people perceive them as a threat. I mean, they may feel like that. The question is whether that is justified or whether that can be alleviated by law as opposed to alleviated by changes in, for example, behavior. And Thomas Sowell makes this point, right? He says that, what exactly, when there's a description of a suspect in a crime and the suspect is black, is that racism or is that just a reality? And when a disproportionate number of young black men are committing crimes and you're walking down the street in the middle of the night and you see a young black man walking down the street dressed, not in a suit, and you walk across the other side of the street, does this make you a racist? So Thomas Sowell says, no, this doesn't. Thomas Sowell's a black economist. He says this doesn't make you a racist. This means that you are just using a heuristic with the available information at hand. Now, if you know the black guy and you know that black guy's not a criminal and you cross the street anyway, then you're a racist because then you've decided that the race is the predominant characteristic about the human being. But human beings use heuristics, right? They use generalities in order to adjudicate the universe around them. Now, is that quote unquote racism? Or is that just using the best available general information? Again, racism would be if you ignore the personal information about the person in favor of the generalized information about their race, right? That would actually be racism. But if your question is that young black men are feeling as though they are a perceived threat, and that means racism, well, I mean, that's true for virtually all groups in the United States. That doesn't mean that the United States is a quote unquote racist society. It also doesn't mean that that's a legal issue such that systemic racism in the United States is quote unquote baked into the cake. When they grow up feeling as though they are being judged as a wrongdoer, they are continually weakened in their self-perception and will feel hopeless. I believe hopelessness and desperation lead to nearly all human suffering. So, okay, let me take the example of Jews. Jews are widely believed to be physically weaker than, and this is true for a long time in Western society. Jews are the weakest among us. These Jews, they're so weak. And Jews self-perceived that way. And you know what solved that? Jews stopping that self-perception and actually acting in ways that were different. Right? The sort of ghetto Jew mentality. This is a big issue in the Jewish community. Sort of ghetto Jew mentality being alleviated among Jews. It was a major issue for Jews in the 20th century. This has been true for literally every group in human history, is that there are perceptions, rooted or unrooted, about that group. And the best way of fighting those perceptions is to behave in responsible and good behavior. That being said, says Thomas, it's not so much that America is actively racist as that it is passively racist. As white people, we tend to deny that we may have prejudice. We don't need to say I'm racist, but we should say I've had biases based on race. This is my point. Everyone has had biases based on race. We have biases based on like that. It is not unique to America that there are people here who have biases based on race. The question is whether that manifests as actual racism in which you use a person's race as a proxy for their character. If you do that, you're doing something wrong. But to suggest that America is broadly writ more racist than other societies, or that that's written into the constitution of our system, that is just not true.